Great. Thank you. Right. So I took for my subject focus more on the first part than the second part, but we can talk about the second part if people are interested. Experts on trial. It's probably worth noting that my remarks are personal, so this is not what Rand thinks, this is what Hans thinks, or other organizations, but there we go. But when we start thinking about experts and facts and data and evidence, I want to take us all back about 8 years. June of 2016, 3 weeks before the British people voted to leave the EU, the leader of the Leave campaign in the UK, so the person that wanted the UK to go, the Right Honourable Michael Gove, he's a Conservative politician, he's still in government, and he said, this country has had enough of experts. In relation to a question that he was asked by a journalist who said, why do you want to leave the EU? Because all the experts are saying this would be a disaster, right? And I think it's a nice example of, are we, because many of us in the room are experts in our particular areas, are we on trial? What are the implications of this? The thing I found particularly interesting, and we'll come back to the Gove quote, is actually, and this is a non-political statement, he's actually probably one of the more creative conservative politicians, and is actually a conservative politician that tends to use data and evidence a lot more than many of his peers. So it was a little bit out of character for him. It felt like at the same time, this country's had enough of experts. And of course, what we're really worrying about here, I think, is the diminishing role of data and evidence in public life more broadly. And this is, something that Rand has looked at quite a lot. And it's a little bit of an outlier, because if you look at lots of other areas in society, business, even sports, data is all over the place. Everybody's using data and evidence. And it seems like, this is the one area, public life, public discourse, that we have a bit of an absence. Rand has looked at this in the context of the US and a bit in Europe on something we call truth decay, right? Nice play of words. And in looking at it, why does this happen? There's a number of kind of challenges I think we have. One is around, we just have a lot of cognitive biases around dealing with truth and evidence. There's a lot of changes to our information ecosystem that we have. We're in a 24-hour news cycle, rises of social media. Our education systems aren't really keeping up with that. There's an absence of teaching people how to think critically. And, it's all about, learning the date of X event as opposed to how do you then interpret and move that forward. And then you just see a lot of political and social polarization as well. I mean, this is a particular problem in the States, an issue in Europe, maybe slightly less so. So I think the conclusion to the question, I'm afraid, Mikhail, is, are experts on trial? Yes. But I would also say that we should be on trial. Because when we're talking about topics that are of such great importance and relevance to society, it's absolutely right to get scrutiny about those things. And indeed, I think we as experts should welcome inquisitive challenge that looks to test what we're saying. So I think it's particularly and completely legitimate for experts to be on trial. And I think sometimes it doesn't always feel that it's the experts themselves that are on trial, but the expertise that we're speaking about. I think, it's increasingly difficult for members of our community to, actually determine who's an expert. We're in an age of 24-hour news cycles. We are not talking about facts for 24 hours. Facts maybe make up about 20 minutes of the 24-hour news cycle. And the rest of it is you bring in people that opine and tell you what they think, but actually don't offer a lot in terms of necessarily facts and expertise. And that's, really challenging. We have our smartphones, we can look things up. We have AI algorithms that can probably work us nice political policy solutions in the blink of an eye. And also, we're not experts on everything. I might have a particular expertise in defense industrial policy, but it doesn't mean that I could then talk about something else with kind of equal regard. And so And that's something I think we don't always acknowledge as much as we should. I mean, as an aside, and it came out in an earlier discussion, I think that's that's one reason why I really like multidisciplinary research. I like the approach that Gary tends to take with these sorts of conferences, because it acknowledges that you kind of need a village of experts and expertise to address particular policy problems. And having that expertise from a variety of fields, humanities, science, social science, even economics, maybe, and a variety of backgrounds, academics, civil servants, practitioners, really should improve the quality of the overall analysis of the things we look at. I think there's also a real challenge around how experts communicate to make a point. I mean, there's a real tension between being very clear in one synthesis and recommendations where you might not mention all the caveats or kind of context that you have, but you need to be really clear to cut through, or being slightly more fulsome in describing the challenge and all of the issues. And I think there's a risk when you're reading the 400-page report that, how do you actually know what's being said? And there is this tension here. I think we all need to acknowledge that. It probably sits somewhere in the middle, but it's also an issue of nuance and judgment and thinking through, for a particular circumstance, how do you need to tailor the message? And then how do you put the nuance and context behind it? How do you do it? I think some of it's about being clear about what your desired outcomes are. What are some of your key assumptions? It drives me crazy when I see scientific presentations that are point estimates and don't have error bands in them, because you actually don't have a sense of where the comparison is, or using scenarios to help you illustrate where you could be. So there are ways that one can do it, but they add a bit of complexity to the discussion, and that's where the challenge is. I think the other challenge here is often it's not about the experts themselves, but it's about other things. And I guess there is a reality, and we've heard it a little bit today already, that among many people in the world, and I would probably particularly talk about the US, the UK, and probably Europe as well, that feel very left behind and ignored. And they think there is this kind of technocratic elite who are out there making decisions that I have very little agency about, and they keep throwing data and evidence at me to justify what they're doing. And I have absolutely I don't feel that I have any ability to influence that whatsoever. And I think, or they don't think about and consider all the various different perspectives. So I think about, European lockdowns, maybe with the exception of Sweden. But when we had not the initial lockdowns, but the later one, certainly in the context of the UK, we had a bunch of scientists flanking the prime minister because he felt he needed that expertise. And they all sat there and said, for public health reasons, we need to go and do this. And there was absolutely no consideration discussed about economic impacts on children, and all of those things. And we're now kind of starting to see some of that. But I think people who have considerations around their businesses or around their kids look at that and they think, this is all being done to me by these scientific experts. Oh my goodness. And I think we just need to kind of recognize that. And that brings me back to the Gove quote, because he didn't actually just say this country is sick of experts. I'm going to defend Michael Gove. I'm not always sure I always do that, but I'm going to do it in this case, because what he actually said was, I think people in this country have had enough of experts from organizations with acronyms saying that they know what's best and they consistently get it wrong. And so I think that's a good reminder for those of us that work at organizations like RAND, R-A-N-D. Okay, it's actually not an acronym, but you get the point, that we need to stay humble and grounded in what we're doing when we're talking about these things. I think there's also sometimes a perception that the experts and the technocratic elite, operate on a do as I say, not as I do basis. And that often, makes the trial collapse even worse. We had a London professor in COVID who talked about the dangers of, if we don't go into lockdown and socially isolate, hundreds of thousands of people are going to die. And then what do you find? The guy breaking all of those rules to run off and see his mistress. Or you see the prime minister and his team having parties in Downing Street the night before Queen Elizabeth has got to sit 20 feet away from everyone when she buries her husband. The credibility of experts, We are very badly hurt on trial when we do not live up to the high standards that we espouse. And so I think that also puts this additional onus on us, which is really important. And I think the last challenge I'd like to reflect on is the fear of some that experts take our agency away. There are all these facts. It is very clear this is what you have to do. And therefore, you kind of reduce the space for expertise, information, and values to have a discussion. I mean, I often have the opposite problem with my team at RAND, who produce really high quality, rigorous analytic work. They produce these reports. They're not 400 pages. They're maybe 20. They say it's very evidence informed. It's very clear. We give it often to our government sponsored clients who take it, read it, look at it, and completely ignore it. And they say, what in the world are we doing? Why are we bothering to do this when they're going to do something else? And I have to remind them that the people that are making these decisions are making those decisions, yes, on the evidence you give them, but also there's a whole range of other factors. And some of those are about their values, some of them are about political considerations. And you have to recognize that that is the reality that we live in. So your job, my researchers at RAND, you're not, but mine, you need to do your job and produce really good evidence and make sure that you're clear around what that says. Let decision makers make those decisions. And particularly when they are elected, the public will make a judgment on those. And often what we find is the public make a judgment pretty decisively. But I think it is really important to create and recognize that there should be space for evidence and values to coexist in discussions. And when you remove one or the other, you slightly get out of balance. I kind of think there, in some senses, there's two sides of the same coin. And you need the evidence, and the evidence is really valuable, but you also have to understand why you're looking at these things. What are the wider considerations? And I think, it means that you're not either operating in a kind of super technocratic environment where you end up in kind of an ultra utilitarian system, or you're operating in a system where people just slightly, make decisions randomly and on a whim because, that's what they grew up listening to their grandmother or grandfather saying. So how do we as experts kind of help square that circle? I think there's a few things we can do. There's a number of things we can't do. There's some things we can do. I think we need to make sure that when we're producing rigorous, high quality work, we're very transparent about what we're doing. What are the limitations? What are the assumptions we're using? We need to find ways to build trust in public institutions. Someone mentioned it earlier. If you don't have trust in public institutions, we're really going to struggle believing what anybody says. We also need to think hard around how information is disseminated. I mean, I might be foreshadowing some of Patty's piece here, but how do we become much more accessible around our scientific communication, and how do we have journalists that can distinguish between fact and not? And how do we build up literacy among our populations? My daughter's 16. She's doing a bunch of public exams in the UK at the moment. She's got, she's taken a whole bunch of courses over the last couple of years: science, mathematics, history, music, dance. The most important class that she's taken, I don't say this to her because the UK government thinks English and mathematics are most important. The most important class that she's taken is one that's been called citizenship. In the United States, we'd call it civics. And it's all about how we operate as a society and what that looks like. And what I've seen with her, and she is not an academic person, her eyes light up. It's her favorite class by a mile because she's able to engage with ideas, with values, and with evidence. And I think instilling more of this in the way that we do wider education also drives that more broadly. And then we just need to be honest with our citizens, and we need to trust them to act responsibly. And often they might surprise us and do the right thing. Thanks.